What would you do if you saw a child drowning, while the richest people in the city just stood there, frozen in fear? This is the story of a 7-year-old boy fighting for his life, a crowd too afraid to act, and one poor maid who risked everything to save him. But what started as a single act of courage would spark a war between love, pride, and power, and the truth will leave you speechless. The storm came suddenly over the Long Island Sound that Friday afternoon. Dark clouds rolling across the horizon as the elite members of the Hampton Shore Country Club gathered around their gleaming infinity pool. The winds shook the palms that had been imported from Florida. Lightning split the sky, and the rain hammered down without mercy. Through the chaos, a desperate scream pierced the air. "Help! Ethan is drowning!" 7-year-old Ethan Miller, son of a wealthy Manhattan investor, had slipped on the slick marble edge and fallen into the pool just as the automated wave system failed to shut down. Now he was thrashing helplessly, his small arms flailing against the manufactured currents that dragged him under again and again. Dozens of impeccably dressed guests stood frozen at the water's edge, women in cocktail dresses, men in tailored blazers, diamonds flashing under each burst of lightning. They gasped, they shouted, they pointed, but none of them jumped in. "Where are the lifeguards?" cried Victoria Hughes, wife of a prominent attorney, clutching her designer shawl tight against the storm. "They left when the lightning started," stammered a waiter, water dripping from his hair. "It's protocol. Pool staff clear out during storms." Ethan's head bobbed above the water for a moment, eyes wide, mouth open, before another wave smothered him. His body was losing the fight fast. "Somebody has to go in," shouted Charles Whitman, a real estate developer in a pressed polo shirt. But he stayed rooted to the spot, unwilling to ruin his Italian loafers. Around him, other men exchanged uneasy glances, each one silently excusing himself with muttered fears of electrocution, of lawsuits, of embarrassment. The boy's movement slowed. His body began to sink, and then, cutting through the storm, through the fear, through the paralysis, came the pounding of sneakers on wet stone. It was Jessica Carter, 25, a maintenance worker at the club. She had run from the service wing, still wearing her Navy work uniform, her hair plastered to her face by the rain. She shoved past the glittering crowd and saw Ethan drifting toward the bottom of the pool. "No one's moving," she cried out, incredulous. "You're just going to let him die?" No answer, just silence, broken only by thunder. Jessica kicked off her shoes and dove headfirst into the churning water. The cold hit her like a slap, but she pressed downward, pushing through the artificial current. Years of swimming in the rough rivers of upstate New York had built her strength, and she reached Ethan just as his tiny body went limp. She hooked her arms under his and surged upward, lungs burning. When they broke the surface, the crowd finally screamed, not in horror this time, but in shock. Jessica hauled Ethan toward the pool's edge, gasping, "Help me lift him!" Hands finally reached down, pulling them both out of the water. Ethan lay motionless on the marble floor, his lips blue. Someone whispered, "He's gone," but Jessica refused to hear it. She pressed her hands to his chest, counting aloud as she gave compressions, then tilted his head back for rescue breaths. "Come on, kid," she urged. "Don't you quit on me now." 1 minute, 2, and then a violent cough. Water gushed from Ethan's mouth, and his chest rose with the ragged sound of life. "He's alive," someone shouted. The crowd erupted in relieved applause, as though they themselves had done something. Jessica sagged back, exhausted, tears mixing with the rain. Ethan blinked weakly, then whispered, "Thank you." It was the first word he spoke, and it was meant only for her. What Jessica didn't know was that the moment would tie her life forever to the powerful Miller family, and awaken enemies who would do anything to keep her in her place. The rain still hammered down over the Hampton Shore Country Club, lightning flashing across the sky in jagged streaks of white. While the wealthy members huddled under umbrellas and expensive shawls, murmuring in awe and disbelief, Jessica Carter knelt on the cold marble tiles beside Ethan Miller, her soaked uniform clinging to her skin. Ethan coughed again, weak and disoriented, but alive. His small fingers clutched the edge of Jessica's sleeve, as though refusing to let go of the one person who had fought for him. Around them, the silence of shock began to break. Oh my God, she really saved him. Someone call 911! Don't just stand there, bring towels. The voices came all at once, frantic and uncoordinated, like the crackling of a fire. Guests rushed forward now that the danger had passed, holding out their silk scarves and linen napkins as though those could help. A man in an expensive suit even tried to pat Jessica's shoulder as if to claim part of her heroism, but Jessica ignored them all. She bent down close to Ethan. "You're safe now, sweetheart," she whispered, brushing wet hair from his forehead. "You're gonna be just fine." Ethan's lips trembled. I thought I was gonna see Mommy," he murmured, voice barely audible over the storm. Jessica froze. She knew enough from gossip among the staff to remember Ethan's mother had died in a car accident less than a year ago. The boy's words pierced her chest like a blade. Before she could respond, the sound of screeching tires tore through the storm. A cherry-red Aston Martin swerved into the circular driveway, headlights glaring against the rain. The door burst open, and Jonathan Miller, Ethan's father, rushed out. Tall, impeccably dressed even in the chaos, Jonathan's presence was like a force of nature itself. His face, usually seen on the covers of financial magazines, was pale with fear as he sprinted across the slick stones. "Ethan!" he shouted, his voice cracking in a way that startled the crowd. He shoved through the cluster of useless onlookers until he dropped to his knees beside his son. Ethan reached a trembling hand toward him, but his other hand still clung tightly to Jessica's soaked sleeve. Jonathan noticed, and for a moment, confusion flickered in his storm-grey eyes. "What happened?" he demanded, his gaze darting from Ethan to Jessica. "She saved him," said one of the women nearby, her jeweled earrings swinging as she pointed. "That girl jumped in. No one else." Jonathan's eyes locked on Jessica then. He saw the wet uniform, the trembling hands, the exhaustion etched into her face. He also saw his son's fragile grip on her, as though Ethan trusted this stranger more than anyone else in the world at that moment. "You pulled him out?" Jonathan asked, his tone low, almost disbelieving. Jessica nodded, brushing hair from her face. "He wasn't breathing. I gave him CPR. He's stable now, but he needs a hospital." As if on cue, the wail of sirens grew louder. Moments later, paramedics hurried through the storm with a stretcher. The crowd parted like a curtain, some whispering, some still staring at Jessica as though she had performed a miracle. Jonathan helped lift Ethan onto the stretcher, but when the boy whimpered and reached toward Jessica again, Jonathan's jaw tightened. He looked at Jessica, then back at his son, before finally speaking. "Come with us," he said firmly. "Please," Jessica hesitated. This was far beyond her job description. She was just a maintenance worker. But Ethan's desperate eyes left her no room to refuse. She climbed into the ambulance beside him, sitting on the narrow bench, while Jonathan hovered close. Inside, as the doors slammed shut, the sound of the storm faded. The ambulance became its own world, sirens wailing, lights flashing against rain-slick streets. Jonathan sat opposite Jessica, his hand gripping Ethan's small fingers. His expensive watch glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights. Yet his eyes, sharp, calculating, the eyes of a man who closed billion-dollar deals, were focused only on his child. Jessica kept her gaze on Ethan, stroking his damp hair gently. The boy leaned into her touch, calming as though she were a familiar presence. Jonathan noticed, and for the first time since the chaos began, his expression softened. "Miss," he hesitated. "What's your name?" "Jessica Carter," she said quietly. "Jessica," Jonathan repeated, as though testing the sound of it. "You saved my son's life. I don't know how to thank you." "There's no need," Jessica replied quickly. "Anyone would have done it." Jonathan's eyes darkened. "No, that's not true. I saw their faces when I arrived. 20 people stood there watching and not one of them moved. You were the only one who acted." The weight of his words filled the ambulance, heavy and undeniable. By the time they reached St. Mary's Children's Hospital, the rain had slowed, though thunder still rumbled in the distance. Nurses rushed Ethan into the emergency ward, Jonathan at his side. Jessica followed a step behind, unsure if she belonged, yet unable to walk away. Hours passed in a blur of doctors, machines, and whispered conversations in sterile corridors. Jessica sat quietly in the waiting area, soaked and shivering, while wealthy patrons who had followed Jonathan to the hospital whispered about her in hushed tones. "That's the maintenance girl, isn't it? Imagine. She actually jumped in. Or imagine if she'd failed. The liability." Jessica tried to ignore them, but the sting of their words cut deep. Then soft footsteps. Jonathan appeared, his expression weary but relieved. "He's going to be fine," he announced, his voice breaking just slightly. Then turning to Jessica, "He keeps asking for you." Jessica's breath caught. She followed him into a private hospital room where Ethan lay in a small bed, hooked to monitors, but smiling weakly when he saw her. "Jessie," he whispered, using a nickname he had invented on the spot. "You came." Tears pricked Jessica's eyes. She sat beside him, holding his hand gently. Jonathan stood at the foot of the bed, watching the scene with an intensity Jessica could feel even without looking. Something unspoken hung in the air, a mixture of gratitude, curiosity, and a spark of something else neither of them dared to name. But beyond the warmth of that hospital room, unseen forces were already shifting, because Jonathan's father, Richard Miller, patriarch of the family empire, was on his way. And unlike Jonathan, Richard did not see Jessica as a savior. He saw her as a threat, and Richard Miller was not a man who tolerated threats. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Children's Hospital flickered faintly as thunder rolled outside. Jessica sat in the corner of Ethan's private room, still damp from the storm, her navy work uniform clinging uncomfortably to her skin. Yet she refused to leave. Ethan's small hand was wrapped firmly around her fingers, as if letting go meant slipping back into the water he had fought so hard against. Jonathan Miller stood by the window, his suit jacket discarded, tie loosened, staring out at the rain-slick streets of Manhattan. For the first time in years, the billionaire looked less like a corporate titan and more like a man utterly shaken. He turned toward Jessica, his sharp features softened by exhaustion. "You know," he began, his voice low, "I've spent my life building walls. Against competitors, against so-called friends, against loss." His eyes flicked toward Ethan. "But I wasn't ready for this. To almost lose him." Jessica glanced up. There was a vulnerability in him that startled her. She wasn't used to seeing men like Jonathan, wealthy, powerful, untouchable, show cracks in their armor. "You didn't lose him," she said quietly. "He's here. That's what matters." Ethan stirred at her words, his eyelids fluttering. "Jessie," he whispered, his voice thin but clear, "will you stay until I fall asleep?" Jessica smiled gently. "Of course, sweetheart." She perched on the edge of the hospital bed, humming softly as she brushed damp hair from his forehead. Within minutes, Ethan drifted into a peaceful sleep, the steady beeping of the monitor the only sound in the room. Jonathan watched in silence, his arms crossed loosely. There was something almost surreal about the sight. His son, smiling in his sleep for the first time in months, and this young woman, this stranger in a soaked uniform, who had somehow brought that peace. But the moment fractured when the door swung open. Richard Miller entered with the weight of authority, flanked by two sharply dressed assistants. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his tailored overcoat still dry despite the storm outside. Every line of his posture radiated control and command. Jonathan stiffened. "Dad," he muttered, his tone clipped. Richard's eyes swept the room, landing immediately on Jessica. His expression hardened, the way a judge might regard a defendant. "So you must be the young woman everyone is talking about." Jessica rose slowly, nerves coiling in her stomach. "Yes, sir. Jessica Carter." Richard studied her from head to toe. The damp uniform, the cheap sneakers set by the chair, the exhaustion written across her face. His lips pressed into a thin line. "I see. Dad." Jonathan interjected, his voice carrying a warning edge. She saved Ethan's life. If it weren't for her, we'd be planning a funeral right now. Richard's gaze never wavered from Jessica. I'm aware of the story, Jonathan. Heroic, brave, noble. His tone dripped with skepticism. But I also know people. And I know opportunity when I see it. Jessica's cheeks burned. Excuse me. Richard took a deliberate step closer, lowering his voice but not softening it. You've inserted yourself into my grandson's life at a very vulnerable moment. A boy without a mother, a father too distracted by grief and business. And here you are, the savior. His eyes narrowed. Tell me, Miss Carter, what is it you really want? Dad! Jonathan's voice was sharp, angry. Jessica clenched her fists, forcing herself to meet Richard's cold stare. With all due respect, sir, I didn't jump into that pool thinking about what I could gain. I did it because a child was drowning. Richard tilted his head, his eyes still calculating. So you claim. Enough, Jonathan snapped. You weren't there, I was. And so was Ethan. He trusts her. That should be all that matters. Richard turned his gaze on his son, disappointment etched into every line of his face. Jonathan, you're a miller. You should know better than to let emotions cloud your judgment. Our family has an image to protect. We can't afford to let strangers blur the lines between staff and kin. Jessica felt the words like knives. Staff, kin, two worlds separated by a wall she had never tried to cross, but which Richard now wielded like a weapon. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Dad, if the image of this family matters more to you than the life of your grandson, then maybe you should leave. The assistant shifted uncomfortably, unused to hearing Jonathan challenge his father so directly. Richard's eyes narrowed, the storm outside mirrored in his expression. But before he could reply, Ethan stirred again. Jessie, he murmured in his sleep, his hand reaching blindly until Jessica gently held it again. His breathing calmed instantly. The silence in the room was deafening. Richard's face hardened further, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned on his heel and strode toward the door. We'll discuss this later, he said flatly, his voice cold as steel. Then he was gone, his entourage trailing behind. The door clicked shut, leaving a thick tension in the air. Jessica sank back into her chair, her hands trembling. Jonathan exhaled slowly, rubbing his forehead. I'm sorry you had to deal with that, he said, his tone softer now. My father, he doesn't trust easily. Or at all, Jessica shook her head. It's fine. I've dealt with worse. But deep inside, she knew it wasn't fine. She had seen the look in Richard Miller's eyes. It wasn't just mistrust. It was a warning. And warnings, she suspected, were only the beginning. Later that night, after Jonathan finally insisted she go home, Jessica rode the subway back to her modest apartment in Queens. She sat silently, clutching the strap of her bag, her reflection in the darkened train window, staring back at her with weary eyes. Her mother, Ellen, was waiting up when she arrived, an older woman with warm eyes and a body worn from years of factory work. Jessie, you're soaked. What happened? Jessica told her everything. The storm, the rescue, the hospital, Richard Miller's words. Ellen listened in silence, her brow furrowed. When Jessica finished, her mother reached across the small kitchen table and took her hand. You did the right thing, Ellen said firmly. Don't let that man make you question it. A child is alive because of you. No amount of money or power can change that truth. Jessica nodded, though her chest still ached with unease. She wanted to believe her mother's words, but she knew the world the Millers lived in was nothing like hers. In their world, truth was often twisted into whatever suited them best, and as she lay awake in her small bedroom that night, listening to the distant hum of the city, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that Richard Miller was already planning his next move. What she didn't know was that at that very moment, in a penthouse overlooking Central Park, Richard sat behind a mahogany desk, a glass of scotch in hand. Giving orders to a private investigator. I want everything on her, he commanded. Background, family, finances. Dig deep, and if there's nothing, then create something. The investigator nodded silently, pocketing the thick envelope of cash Richard slid across the desk. For Richard Miller, threats weren't argued with. They were eliminated, and Jessica Carter, whether she realized it yet or not, had just become one. The following morning, the storm had passed over Manhattan, but inside the Miller penthouse, another kind of storm was just beginning to brew. The sky outside was crystal clear, the city washed clean by rain, but the atmosphere in Richard Miller's study was thick with tension. The patriarch sat at his imposing mahogany desk, a cigar smoldering in the ashtray beside him, while stacks of leather-bound ledgers and framed photographs of political handshakes lined the shelves behind. Across from him stood Ignacio Vega, a private investigator with a reputation for digging up dirt, no matter how deep it was buried. He placed a thick manila folder onto the desk. Richard adjusted his glasses and opened it, skimming through pages of neatly typed reports and grainy photographs. Jessica Carter's life unfolded in cold detail. Her modest Queens apartment. Her mother Ellen, who worked part-time sewing. Her younger brother Michael, barely 20, who was juggling community college classes with shifts at a warehouse. Nothing criminal, no arrests, no scandals. Impeccable, Ignacio admitted reluctantly. The girl is clean, too clean. Richard's lips curled into a thin smile. Everyone has weaknesses, and if they don't, we make them. He closed the folder with a decisive snap. I don't need her to be guilty. I only need her to look guilty. Ignacio raised an eyebrow. Planting evidence? Richard leaned back in his chair, smoke curling around his head like a crown. Perception is more powerful than truth. If I can convince Jonathan, or the board of directors, or the press, that she is dangerous to the family, then she'll vanish from our lives without me lifting another finger. Meanwhile, across the city, Jessica tried to piece together the fragments of her new, chaotic reality. She had slept poorly, haunted by Richard's cold stare, and now sat at the small kitchen table in her Queens apartment with her mother Ellen, sipping instant coffee. Ellen reached across the table. Honey, you're shaking. Did that man scare you that much? Jessica stared into her mug. It's not just him, Mom. It's the way he looked at me. Like I was some kind of intruder. Like saving Ethan was suspicious. Ellen frowned. Suspicious? Saving a child from drowning? That's the most human thing anyone could do. Jessica gave a bitter laugh. In their world, maybe nothing is just human. Everything's a transaction, an angle. Before Ellen could respond, Jessica's phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a number she didn't recognize. Hesitant, she answered. Jessica, it's Jonathan Miller. Her pulse jumped. She hadn't expected to hear from him so soon. Mr. Miller, she began, but he interrupted. Jonathan, he corrected gently. Please, after everything you did for Ethan, the least I can do is ask you to use my name. Jessica hesitated. All right, Jonathan. There was a pause on the other end, then his voice lowered. Ethan hasn't stopped asking for you. He barely slept last night, I think. He feels safe when you're around. And honestly, Jonathan exhaled. So do I. Jessica's heart thudded painfully in her chest. I'm glad he's all right, but I don't want to cause any trouble. My father doesn't speak for me, Jonathan cut in, steel entering his tone. And certainly not for my son. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Finally, Jonathan said, Would you come by the house this evening? Just for dinner. Ethan wants you there. Jessica closed her eyes. She thought of Richard's warning, of the threat that still lingered in the back of her mind. But then she remembered Ethan's trembling voice in the ambulance, whispering, Jessie, you came. I'll come, she said softly. That evening, Jessica found herself standing before the wrought-iron gates of the Miller estate, her nerves coiled tight. The mansion beyond looked like something from a magazine, manicured gardens, windows glowing warmly against the twilight, and the faint sound of classical music drifting from within. A uniformed driver opened the gates, greeting her politely, and she walked up the long drive with trembling hands, clutching a small paper bag. Inside was a children's book she'd bought with her own money, a simple story about a lost puppy finding its way home. When the front doors opened, Ethan was there, rushing forward in his pajamas. "Jessie!" he cried, flinging his arms around her waist. Jessica knelt, hugging him tight. "Hey, champ, I brought you something." She pulled the book from the bag, and his eyes lit up. "Dad, Jessie brought me a new story," Ethan shouted, running toward the living room with the book clutched to his chest. Jonathan appeared behind him, dressed casually in a button-down and slacks, his expression softening when he saw Jessica. "Thank you for coming." Jessica gave a small nod. "For Ethan." They followed Ethan into the living room, where a fire crackled warmly in the hearth. Dinner was served not in the formal dining hall, but in the smaller family room, a deliberate choice, Jonathan explained, to make Jessica feel less like a guest and more like family. Over roasted chicken and mashed potatoes, Ethan chatted endlessly about school, about his favorite cartoons, about a science project he wanted to build. Jessica listened with rapt attention, laughing at his jokes, asking questions, her warmth filling the empty spaces in the mansion that no wealth could touch. Jonathan watched quietly, sipping his wine, and every so often his gaze lingered on Jessica longer than it should have. There was something about the way she leaned in when Ethan spoke, the way she listened as though his words mattered more than anything. Jonathan couldn't remember the last time his home had felt this alive, but upstairs, in a darkened study overlooking the garden, Richard Miller stood silently, watching the scene unfold through the glass balcony doors. His jaw tightened as he saw his grandson curled against Jessica, listening intently to the story about the lost puppy. His phone buzzed. He answered without taking his eyes off the scene below. "Yes?" Ignacio's voice came through. "I found something, not on Jessica herself, but on her brother." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Go on." Michael Carter, 20 years old, arrested once for shoplifting when he was 16. Case dismissed, but it's still on record. And last year, he fell behind on tuition payments. He owes the community college nearly $2,000. Small things, but exploitable. Richard's lips curved into a slow smile. "Excellent. Leak it discreetly. Make sure it reaches the tabloids. A scandal in the family, however minor, will raise questions about her judgment, her background. Jonathan won't be able to ignore it." "Yes, sir." As Richard ended the call, his eyes drifted back to the firelit room, where Jessica was tucking the blanket around Ethan's small shoulders. Her voice soft as she read the final lines of the story. "She's dangerous," Richard murmured to himself. "Not because of what she's done, but because of what she makes them feel." He crushed the cigar into the ashtray beside him. "And feelings," he whispered, "are weaknesses." That night, as Jessica prepared to leave, Ethan clung to her. "Will you come back tomorrow?" he asked, his eyes wide with hope. Jessica glanced at Jonathan, uncertain. Jonathan smiled faintly. "Only if Jessie wants to." Jessica knelt and kissed Ethan's forehead. "I'll try, sweetheart. I promise." Ethan grinned, satisfied, and scampered upstairs. Left alone in the foyer, Jessica turned toward the door. Jonathan's voice stopped her. "Jessica!" She looked back. His eyes were searching, conflicted. "I don't know where this is going, but I know you've brought something into this house that's been missing for a long time." Jessica's throat tightened. She wanted to respond, but the words caught in her chest. So instead she simply nodded and slipped into the night. Neither of them knew that by morning the headlines would scream, "Hero Maid's troubled brother, hidden scandals of the Carter family," and the war Richard Miller had promised was about to explode. The following morning, the storm had passed over Manhattan, but inside the Miller penthouse, another kind of storm was just beginning to brew. The sky outside was crystal clear, the city washed clean by rain, but the atmosphere in Richard Miller's study was thick with tension. The patriarch sat at his imposing mahogany desk, a cigar smoldering in the ashtray beside him, while stacks of leather-bound ledgers and framed photographs of political handshakes lined the shelves behind. Across from him stood Ignacio Vega, a private investigator with a reputation for digging up dirt, no matter how deep it was buried. He placed a thick manila folder onto the desk. Richard adjusted his glasses and opened it, skimming through pages of neatly typed reports and grainy photographs. Jessica Carter's life unfolded in cold detail. Her modest Queen's apartment, her mother Ellen, who worked part-time sewing, her younger brother Michael, barely 20, who was juggling community college classes with shifts at a warehouse. Nothing criminal, no arrests, no scandals. Impeccable, Ignacio admitted reluctantly. The girl is clean. Too clean. Richard's lips curled into a thin smile. Everyone has weaknesses, and if they don't, we make them. He closed the folder with a decisive snap. I don't need her to be guilty. I only need her to look guilty. Ignacio raised an eyebrow. Planting evidence? Richard leaned back in his chair, smoke curling around his head like a crown. Perception is more powerful than truth. If I can convince Jonathan, or the board of directors, or the press, that she is dangerous to the family, then she'll vanish from our lives without me lifting another finger. Meanwhile, across the city, Jessica tried to piece together the fragments of her new, chaotic reality. She had slept poorly, haunted by Richard's cold stare, and now sat at the small kitchen table in her Queen's apartment with her mother Ellen, sipping instant coffee. Ellen reached across the table. Honey, you're shaking. Did that man scare you that much? Jessica stared into her mug. It's not just him, Mom. It's the way he looked at me. Like I was some kind of intruder. Like saving Ethan was... Suspicious, Ellen frowned. Suspicious? Saving a child from drowning? That's the most human thing anyone could do. Jessica gave a bitter laugh. In their world, maybe nothing is just human. Everything's a transaction, an angle. Before Ellen could respond, Jessica's phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a number she didn't recognize. Hesitant, she answered. Jessica. It's Jonathan Miller. Her pulse jumped. She hadn't expected to hear from him so soon. Mr. Miller, she began, but he interrupted. Jonathan, he corrected gently. Please, after everything you did for Ethan, the least I can do is ask you to use my name. Jessica hesitated. All right, Jonathan. There was a pause on the other end, then his voice lowered. Ethan hasn't stopped asking for you. He barely slept last night. I think he feels safe when you're around. And honestly, Jonathan exhaled. So do I. Jessica's heart thudded painfully in her chest. I'm glad he's all right, but I don't want to cause any trouble. My father doesn't speak for me, Jonathan cut in, steel entering his tone. And certainly not for my son. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Finally, Jonathan said, Would you come by the house this evening? Just for dinner? Ethan wants you there. Jessica closed her eyes. She thought of Richard's warning, of the threat that still lingered in the back of her mind. But then she remembered Ethan's trembling voice in the ambulance, whispering, Jessie, you came. I'll come, she said softly, that evening. Jessica found herself standing before the wrought-iron gates of the Miller estate, her nerves coiled tight. The mansion beyond looked like something from a magazine, manicured gardens, windows glowing warmly against the twilight, and the faint sound of classical music drifting from within. A uniformed driver opened the gates, greeting her politely, and she walked up the long drive with trembling hands, clutching a small paper bag. Inside was a children's book she'd bought with her own money, a simple story about a lost puppy finding its way home. When the front doors opened, Ethan was there rushing forward in his pajamas. Jessie! He cried, flinging his arms around her waist. Jessica knelt, hugging him tight. Hey, champ, I brought you something. She pulled the book from the bag, and his eyes lit up. Dad. Jessie brought me a new story. Ethan shouted, running toward the living room with the book clutched to his chest. Jonathan appeared behind him, dressed casually in a button-down and slacks, his expression softening when he saw Jessica. Thank you for coming. Jessica gave a small nod. For Ethan. They followed Ethan into the living room, where a fire crackled warmly in the hearth. Dinner was served not in the formal dining hall, but in the smaller family room. A deliberate choice, Jonathan explained, to make Jessica feel less like a guest and more like family. Over roasted chicken and mashed potatoes, Ethan chattered endlessly about school, about his favorite cartoons, about a science project he wanted to build. Jessica listened with rapt attention, laughing at his jokes, asking questions. Her warmth filling the empty spaces in the mansion that no wealth could touch. Jonathan watched quietly, sipping his wine, and every so often his gaze lingered on Jessica longer than it should have. There was something about the way she leaned in when Ethan spoke, the way she listened as though his words mattered more than anything. Jonathan couldn't remember the last time his home had felt this alive, but upstairs, in a darkened study overlooking the garden, Richard Miller stood silently, watching the scene unfold through the glass balcony doors. His jaw tightened as he saw his grandson curled against Jessica, listening intently to the story about the lost puppy. His phone buzzed. He answered without taking his eyes off the scene below. "Yes?" Ignacio's voice came through. "I found something. Not on Jessica herself, but on her brother." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Go on, Michael Carter, 20 years old. Arrested once for shoplifting when he was 16. Case dismissed, but it's still on record. And last year he fell behind on tuition payments. He owes the community college nearly $2,000. Small things, but exploitable." Richard's lips curved into a slow smile. "Excellent. Leak it discreetly. Make sure it reaches the tabloids. A scandal in the family, however minor, will raise questions about her judgment, her background. Jonathan won't be able to ignore it?" "Yes, sir." As Richard ended the call, his eyes drifted back to the firelit room where Jessica was tucking the blanket around Ethan's small shoulders. Her voice soft as she read the final lines of the story. "She's dangerous," Richard murmured to himself. "Not because of what she's done, but because of what she makes them feel." He crushed the cigar into the ashtray beside him. "And feelings," he whispered, "are weaknesses." That night, as Jessica prepared to leave, Ethan clung to her. "Will you come back tomorrow?" he asked, his eyes wide with hope. Jessica glanced at Jonathan, uncertain. Jonathan smiled faintly. "Only if Jessie wants to." Jessica knelt and kissed Ethan's forehead. "I'll try, sweetheart. I promise." Ethan grinned, satisfied, and scampered upstairs. Left alone in the foyer, Jessica turned toward the door. Jonathan's voice stopped her. "Jessica," she looked back. His eyes were searching, conflicted. "I don't know where this is going, but I know you've brought something into this house that's been missing for a long time." Jessica's throat tightened. She wanted to respond, but the words caught in her chest. So instead, she simply nodded and slipped into the night. Neither of them knew that by morning the headlines would scream, "Hero Maid's troubled brother, hidden scandals of the Carter family," and the war Richard Miller had promised was about to explode. The storm that had raged inside the Miller mansion that night didn't die with silence. It lingered, like smoke after a fire, filling every corridor with tension. Jessica left the estate with her head held high, though her chest ached from the venom in Richard's words. She returned to Queens past midnight, the subway almost empty, her thoughts louder than the screeching wheels of the train. When she reached home, her mother Ellen was still awake. Ellen didn't ask questions. She simply pulled her daughter into a hug, and Jessica broke down for the first time since the drowning. She sobbed against her mother's shoulder, shaking with the exhaustion of carrying a battle she hadn't asked for. "Let it out, Jessie," Ellen whispered. "Let it out. Tomorrow we fight." The next day dawned with icy brightness. Jessica tried to slip quietly into her shift at the club, but whispers chased her through every hallway. "There she is. Her brother's a thief. I heard she set the whole thing up for attention." By lunchtime, Jessica was summoned to the manager's office. Maurice Clarkson, the club director, sat stiffly behind his desk. His eyes darted nervously, as though afraid to meet hers directly. "Jessica," he began, "we appreciate your service here, but in light of recent publicity, the board feels it's best to suspend you until further notice." Jessica's chest tightened. "Suspend me for what?" "For saving a child's life." Maurice coughed, shuffling papers. "This isn't personal. It's about the club's image. We can't have scandal attached to our staff." Jessica stood, her voice trembling but strong. "You mean you can't have me attached to the Millers? Your board doesn't care about truth, only about power." Maurice didn't respond. He simply slid an envelope across the desk. Her suspension notice. Jessica left the office with her head high, but her world felt like it was collapsing beneath her. The job had been her family's main support. Rent, her brother's tuition, her mother's medical bills, everything now hung by a thread. Meanwhile, at the Miller estate, Jonathan was pacing his study like a caged lion. His phone buzzed with board members demanding explanations for the Maid scandal, as they called it. But Jonathan ignored them. His mind was on Jessica, how she must be feeling, what she must be enduring because of his father's schemes. The door opened and Ethan peeked in. His pajamas were rumpled, his eyes red. "Daddy," he whispered, "Jessie didn't come today." Jonathan knelt, pulling his son close. She wanted to. But some people made it hard for her. Ethan frowned. "Is Grandpa being mean again?" Jonathan hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but listen to me, Ethan. Jessie didn't do anything wrong. She's brave. She's kind. And we're not going to let anyone take her away from us, okay?" Ethan's small fists clenched. "I'll tell Grandpa myself. Jessie's my hero." Jonathan smiled faintly, but his heart ached. He knew his father's influence stretched far beyond their family. It touched the press, the club, the board of directors, even the city itself. Fighting him would not be easy. That afternoon, Jonathan drove to Queens. He didn't send his driver. He didn't call ahead. He wanted Jessica to see him not as a billionaire, but as a man. He found her in front of her apartment building, sitting on the stoop with her brother Michael. She looked tired, shadows under her eyes, her uniform folded in her lap. "Jessica," Jonathan said gently. She looked up, startled. "What are you doing here?" "I had to see you." His eyes softened as they met hers. "I heard about the suspension. I'm sorry." Jessica laughed bitterly. "Sorry doesn't pay rent." Jonathan crouched down so they were eye level. "Then let me help." Her face hardened. "No, don't you dare." "I won't be your charity project." Jonathan shook his head. "This isn't charity. You saved my son. You've given him something I couldn't. Peace, joy. He needs you, Jessica." "And so do I." Jessica blinked, stunned by his honesty. Her throat tightened. "Jonathan, your father will never allow it. He's already destroying my family." Michael, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "Then maybe it's time someone stood up to him." Jonathan turned toward him, surprised by the fire in the young man's voice. "You think I haven't tried?" Jonathan muttered. "He controls everything. The board, the press, even the club." "Then go public," Michael shot back. "Tell the world what he's doing. People think you're just another rich guy. Show them you're more than that." Jonathan stared at him, the idea sparking in his mind like lightning. That evening, Jonathan called a press conference. Reporters swarmed the steps of Miller Enterprises headquarters, their cameras flashing. "Mr. Miller, is it true your son's rescuer is involved in scandal? Will she be banned from your family?" Jonathan raised a hand, silencing the chaos. His voice, when he spoke, was steady, deliberate. "My son is alive today because of Jessica Carter. No headline, no rumor, no smear campaign will ever change that fact. She risked her life when no one else would. And I will not stand by while her name is dragged through the mud." Reporters gasped. Pens scribbled furiously. Jonathan continued, his voice rising with conviction. "My father believes reputation is built on power and fear. I believe it's built on truth and courage. And Jessica Carter is living proof of that." The crowd erupted in questions, but Jonathan stepped back, leaving his words to echo. At the penthouse, Richard watched the broadcast on his massive flat screen. His hand trembled as he poured another glass of scotch, fury twisting his face. "Defying me in public," he muttered. "My own son." He slammed the glass down, shattering it across the marble floor. "You've chosen your side, Jonathan. So be it. This war has only begun." Back in Queens, Jessica sat with her mother and brother. Watching Jonathan's speech on their old TV, tears blurred her vision. "He stood up for me," she whispered. Ellen smiled, brushing her daughter's hair back. "Because he sees what I see. A girl with a brave heart." Michael leaned forward, determination in his eyes. "Jess, this isn't just about you anymore. It's about fighting for what's right. For Ethan, for all of us." Jessica nodded slowly, the weight of it settling in her chest. She had been thrown into a world of power and politics she never asked for. But now she knew she couldn't walk away. For Ethan's sake, for Jonathan's sake, and for her own dignity, she would fight. And in the glittering towers of Manhattan, Richard Miller began laying out the next phase of his plan, one that would strike not only at Jessica's reputation, but at her very survival. Because for Richard, this was no longer about image. It was about control, and he would destroy anyone who dared to take it from him. The fallout from Jonathan's public defense of Jessica rippled across New York like shockwaves. Overnight, the story transformed from a tabloid smear into a media frenzy. Morning talk shows debated the Miller family rift. Newspapers ran side-by-side photos of Jonathan standing proudly beside Jessica against photos of Richard looking grim and stern. On social media, hashtags trended: "Stand with Jessica Miller, family drama," "Hero, not Maid." Half the city seemed to side with Jonathan and Jessica, praising her bravery and condemning the smear tactics. The other half echoed Richard's insinuations, sneering that Jessica was a gold digger using Ethan's trauma to climb into the Miller fortune. At the Miller Enterprises headquarters, Richard gathered the board of directors in a polished, glass-walled conference room. The men and women around the table were titans of finance and industry, each tied to Richard's empire through money, politics, or favors owed. Richard stood at the head of the table, a projector casting Jessica's image on the wall. "This woman," Richard began, his voice calm but icy, "is not the issue. The issue is my son's judgment. He has allowed a working-class distraction to threaten the stability of this family, and by extension, this company." One board member, a heavy-set man with a diamond pinky ring, frowned. "With all respect, Richard, the public seems to love her. Your grandson's story is heartwarming." The press conference gained sympathy. Richard's eyes sharpened. Sympathy doesn't build empires. Discipline does. If Jonathan insists on humiliating us publicly, we may need to reconsider his role as heir apparent. A ripple of unease spread through the boardroom. To strip Jonathan of succession was unthinkable, but Richard had never spoken idly. "Are you suggesting," another member asked carefully, "that the board vote to transfer interim control to you indefinitely?" Richard gave a thin smile. "I'm suggesting that if Jonathan refuses to think like a Miller, then he cannot lead like one. We must protect our legacy." Several heads nodded. The coup was beginning. Back in Queens, Jessica tried to live normally, but normalcy had slipped through her fingers. Paparazzi camped outside her apartment, snapping photos whenever she left for groceries or work. Reporters shouted cruel questions. "Jessica, do you love Jonathan Miller? Are you planning to marry into money? Is your brother a criminal influence on Ethan?" One morning, as Jessica escorted her mother to a doctor's appointment, a photographer shoved a camera in her face. Michael, furious, lunged at him. The confrontation was filmed, twisted online, and by evening, new headlines read, "Carter Family Violence, Brother of Hero Maid Attacks Paparazzi." Jessica's heart sank as she scrolled through the coverage. "They're destroying us, Mom, piece by piece." Ellen placed a firm hand on her daughters. "And yet they can't touch your heart, or what you did for that boy. Don't forget that, Jessie." Meanwhile, Jonathan was waging his own war. He met with his late wife's sister, Patricia Bennett, a child psychologist who adored Ethan. Patricia listened intently as Jonathan poured out everything. Richard's manipulation, the board's pressure, Jessica's suffering. "You have to tread carefully," Patricia warned. "Your father isn't just trying to protect the family name. He's testing you. To him, this is about power. If you defy him, he'll escalate until someone breaks." Jonathan rubbed his temples. "Then let him come at me. I'll take it." Patricia leaned forward, her eyes piercing. "It's not you I'm worried about. It's Jessica. She doesn't have the shields you do. And Ethan, he's in the crossfire." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Then I'll shield them both." That night, Jonathan invited Jessica to a quiet dinner at his penthouse. Not the grand estate, but his personal apartment overlooking the East River. It was simple, elegant, with books on the shelves and photographs of Ethan with his late mother. Jessica arrived in a plain dress, her nerves taut. She felt out of place amid the polished marble and panoramic views. But when Jonathan opened the door, wearing no tie and looking more like a man than a billionaire, some of her tension eased over pasta and wine. They spoke, not of the scandal, not of Richard, but of themselves. Jessica shared stories of her childhood summers in upstate New York, swimming in rivers with currents so strong they nearly swept her away. Jonathan laughed for the first time in weeks as she mimicked the shouts of her younger brother during those adventures. Then he spoke of Ethan's birth, of how terrified and overjoyed he had been, of how losing his wife had broken something inside him he thought could never be fixed. Jessica reached across the table, hesitantly placing her hand over his. "You're not broken, Jonathan. You're just scarred. And scars mean you survived." Their eyes locked. For a moment, the city outside ceased to exist, but then Jonathan's phone buzzed. The caller ID made his stomach drop. Richard Miller. He silenced it, slipping the phone face down on the table. "Not tonight," he said firmly. Jessica exhaled, both relieved and uneasy. She knew the storm outside this room was only gathering strength. At the same time, Richard sat in his penthouse study, staring at a framed photo of Ethan. His fingers tapped the desk as Ignacio, the investigator, stood before him. "You've played your part well," Richard said. "But it's not enough. We need to sever her connection completely. She must be too toxic for Jonathan to defend." Ignacio hesitated. "She's resilient. Every attempt to smear her only makes the public like her more. And Jonathan's press conference gave her credibility." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Then we stop fighting in the press. We fight where she can't win, in her livelihood, in her safety, in the shadows." Ignacio shifted uncomfortably. "What are you suggesting?" Richard leaned forward, his voice like ice. "Accidents happen in this city every day. A fall down subway stairs. A mugging gone wrong. People forget, move on. My son mourns but eventually understands. Ethan adapts. And the family's honor remains intact." Ignacio froze, realizing what Richard was implying. "You can't mean..." Richard cut him off. "You work for me. You'll do as you're told." For the first time, Ignacio hesitated to nod. But Richard's glare left no room for refusal. The next morning, Jessica walked Ethan to his schoolyard. She had offered to accompany him, knowing the paparazzi might swarm otherwise. Ethan clung to her hand, proud to show her off to his classmates. "This is Jessie," he announced to a curious boy. "She saved me." Jessica laughed, ruffling his hair. For a moment, it felt like normal life. A child, a school, morning sun over brick buildings. But as she walked back toward the subway, she felt eyes on her. A dark sedan idled across the street. The same car seemed to appear again when she changed trains, and later outside the grocery store. Her instincts screamed. Something wasn't right. That evening, she told Jonathan. His face hardened with fury. "He wouldn't," Jonathan muttered. Then he corrected himself. "No, he would." Jessica's hands trembled. "What do we do?" Jonathan reached for her hand, his voice low and steady. "We protect Ethan. We protect you. Whatever it takes." Unbeknownst to them, in a skyscraper office high above Manhattan, Richard Miller was already tightening the noose. The war for Ethan's heart, for Jessica's dignity, for Jonathan's very soul, was about to erupt into something darker than any of them had ever imagined. The days following Jonathan's declaration of loyalty to Jessica were some of the most volatile the Miller family had seen in decades. What began as whispers in boardrooms and gossip columns now surged like a tidal wave through the arteries of New York high society. The very air seemed charged, as though everyone in the city waited for the inevitable explosion between Jonathan Miller and his father. Richard's calculated moves. Richard was not a man who lost battles. He had built an empire from concrete and steel, transforming the Miller name into one synonymous with wealth and political influence. Yet here he was, his legacy threatened not by a rival tycoon or a hostile takeover, but by a young woman with no pedigree, no wealth, and no armor beyond her courage. In the private sanctum of his penthouse study, Richard summoned Ignacio Vega, the investigator who had already unearthed the Carter family's debts and vulnerabilities. This time the air was heavier, the stakes darker. "You've watched her routines," Richard said, swirling amber scotch in a crystal tumbler. "You know where she shops, the subway lines she takes, the shifts she works. Accidents happen in this city every day. A slip on the stairs, a mugging gone too far, a car that loses control on a wet street. These things don't make headlines, not when they involve nobodies." Ignacio's jaw tightened. He had carried out many unpleasant jobs, but this was a line even he hadn't crossed for the Millers before. "Sir, eliminating her, that's different than digging up dirt. People will notice. Jonathan will never forgive." Richard cut him off sharply. "Jonathan is blinded by infatuation. He'll recover. Ethan will grieve, but children adapt. My family's reputation will endure. That girl will not be the one who brings us down." For a long moment Ignacio said nothing, then gave a reluctant nod. "Understood. I'll start with options that minimize suspicion." "Good." Richard's gaze turned to the glittering skyline. "And Ignacio? No mistakes. She must vanish cleanly, without any trace that leads back here." Jessica under watch. Meanwhile, Jessica was becoming increasingly aware of the shadow trailing her every step. On the subway, she noticed the same man in a leather jacket, always a few cars behind. At the bodega, a black sedan idled longer than any customer would. Even when she took Ethan to the park, pretending everything was normal for his sake, she felt eyes boring into her from across the street. At night, she lay awake in her small bedroom in Queens, staring at the ceiling while her mother and brother slept in the next room. Fear coiled in her chest, but so did resolve. She had faced worse than whispers and threats, poverty, humiliation, endless labor. But this was different. This was war. She began carrying pepper spray in her purse, checking over her shoulder, memorizing license plates. But she didn't tell her family the full extent of her fear. They already carried too much weight. Jonathan's battle within. At Miller Enterprises, Jonathan fought his own war. The board, influenced heavily by Richard, convened an emergency meeting to review leadership direction, cloaked in corporate jargon. It was, in reality, a coup attempt. Jonathan sat at the long mahogany table, the Manhattan skyline stretching endlessly behind him. Across from him, Richard presided like a king holding court. "Jonathan," Richard said smoothly, "your recent public behavior has raised concerns, aligning our family name with distractions. The shareholders demand stability." Jonathan's fists clenched under the table. "If by distractions you mean the woman who saved my son's life, then I'll gladly stand distracted every day." A murmur ran through the board members. Some admired his defiance. Others feared Richard's wrath. Richard leaned forward, his voice steel wrapped in velvet. "This isn't about gratitude. It's about responsibility. One day soon, this company will be yours to lead. Do you think the investors will rally behind a man who invites scandal into his home?" Jonathan shot back, his voice rising. "The only scandal here is that 20 people watched a child drown while one woman acted. And you call her the liability?" The room fell into uneasy silence. Even Richard couldn't hide the flicker of surprise at his son's boldness. Ethan's innocent faith. Through all of this, Ethan remained blissfully unaware of the full scale of the storm. To him, Jessica was simply Jessie, the woman who read him bedtime stories and taught him to trust the water again. He clung to her presence like a life raft, his laughter brighter, his nightmares fewer. One night, Jonathan overheard Ethan praying softly before bed. "God, please keep Jessie safe. She's my angel. Don't let Grandpa be mean to her. Don't let her go away like Mommy." Jonathan stood frozen in the hallway, tears burning his eyes. In that moment, he realized it wasn't just his heart or Jessica's dignity on the line. Ethan's healing depended on her. Losing Jessica could shatter the fragile progress his son had made since Sophia's death. The ambush happened on a rainy Tuesday evening. Jessica had stayed late cleaning the offices at the club. As she stepped out into the nearly empty parking lot, umbrella in hand, she sensed movement behind her. Two men in hooded jackets approached, their footsteps quickening. One grabbed her arm. Wallet, phone, now. Her instincts screamed this wasn't a simple mugging. Their grip was too practiced, their eyes too cold. Jessica shoved her purse at them, but twisted free, sprinting toward the street. Her shoes splashed through puddles, heart hammering. Behind her, the men gave chase. She darted between cars, adrenaline flooding her veins. A hand snagged her jacket, but she yanked herself loose, stumbling into the open road. Headlights flared, an oncoming SUV screeched. Swerving to avoid her, the two men melted into the shadows, leaving Jessica trembling in the rain. When she finally reached the subway station, soaked and shaking, she knew this wasn't random. This was orchestrated. Jonathan's fury. When Jessica told Jonathan what had happened, his fury was volcanic. "He sent them," Jonathan hissed, pacing his apartment. "My own father. He's crossed the line." Jessica's voice shook. "What if he tries again? What if he goes after my family instead?" Jonathan stopped, looking at her with a fire she hadn't seen before. "Then we don't wait for him to strike. We fight back, legally, publicly, whatever it takes. If my father wants war, he'll have it." He pulled her close, his voice steadier. "But I swear, Jessica, you won't face it alone. Not while I breathe." Richard's next gambit in his office the next morning, Richard learned of the botched ambush. Ignacio reported cautiously, "She escaped. The timing wasn't ideal." Richard's eyes narrowed to slits. "Then we escalate. If shadows fail, we turn the spotlight. We ruin her in the court of public opinion so thoroughly that Jonathan himself will doubt her. Everyone has a secret. Find hers. If she has none, create one." Ignacio hesitated, then nodded. Richard poured himself another drink, staring out at the glittering skyline. "Jonathan thinks this is about love. He's wrong. This is about survival. And in survival, only the ruthless endure." Jessica didn't yet know how far Richard was prepared to go, or how close his next move would come to destroying everything she loved. But the battle lines were drawn. The storm had become a war, and the war was about to engulf them all. The city never slept, and neither did whispers. Within a week of the failed ambush on Jessica, a new storm brewed, this one not from the skies but from the press, the screens, and the mouths of New York's elite. The manufactured scandal. It began with a headline in a glossy gossip magazine. "Who is the mystery woman entrancing Jonathan Miller?" The article painted Jessica not as a hero, but as a cunning opportunist. Grainy, long-lens photographs, clearly taken without her knowledge, showed her walking with Jonathan and Ethan in Central Park, shopping for groceries in her modest Queens neighborhood, even boarding the subway. The captions twisted innocence into insinuation, a calculated rise from cleaning floors to catching the eye of New York's most eligible bachelor. Within days, more outlets piled on. Anonymous sources claimed Jessica had a troubled past. Debts, unstable jobs, even whispers of a prior relationship with a married man. None of it was true, but in a city that thrived on scandal, truth mattered little. Social media erupted. Some hailed her as a Cinderella figure. Others sneered that she was a gold digger preying on Jonathan's grief and Ethan's vulnerability. Memes and hashtags trended, as should Miller mistake. "Your gold digger Jess." At the club, Jessica became an object of open gossip. Elegant women who once ignored her now stared openly, whispering behind manicured hands. Colleagues avoided her, fearful of association. Her hours were cut again, under the guise of restructuring. Jessica felt her world shrinking, walls closing in. Ethan's innocent outcry. The Miller mansion was no refuge either. Ethan had overheard classmates at his elite private school parroting the slurs their parents repeated at dinner tables. "Your dad's girlfriend's a maid," one boy sneered. "She just wants money." That night, Ethan burst into tears in his bedroom, clutching Jessica's hand. "Jessie, they say you're bad, but you saved me. You love me. Why are they lying?" Jessica swallowed her tears, brushing his hair back gently. "Because, sweetheart, sometimes people are afraid of what they don't understand." When they can't control something, they try to destroy it. Ethan pressed his face into her shoulder. I don't care what they say. I just want you. Jonathan, standing silently in the doorway, felt both pride and dread. His son's words echoed his own heart, but how much could a 7-year-old bear? Jonathan strikes back. Jonathan refused to stay passive. At a press conference meant to announce a new housing project, he stunned reporters by addressing the scandal directly. The woman you're all so eager to vilify, he said firmly, is the one who saved my son's life when none of us did. Jessica Carter is not a scandal, she is a hero, and I will not tolerate her being slandered for doing what was right. The room buzzed with flashing cameras, murmurs, and hastily scribbled notes. But even as his declaration went viral, it fueled more debate. Was Jonathan blinded by grief, by gratitude, or by infatuation? Behind the scenes, Richard fumed. His son had turned a private family matter into a public standoff. To Richard, this wasn't only rebellion, it was betrayal. Richard's counter-offensive. Richard's next move was subtle but brutal. He arranged a lavish gala for the Miller Foundation, inviting the city's most powerful bankers, senators, media moguls. It was meant to remind Jonathan and the world of the family's reach. Jessica was not invited, but she attended anyway on Jonathan's arm. When they entered the ballroom together, all conversation ceased. Champagne flutes hovered mid-air, violins faltered, whispers spread like wildfire. Richard approached, flanked by donors. His smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Jonathan, he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, you've brought company. Jonathan squeezed Jessica's hand. This is Jessica Carter. She saved Ethan. She's part of our family. Richard's eyes flicked over her simple navy dress, her nervous smile. A janitor among governors and CEOs. How refreshing. Laughter rippled, cruel and knowing. Jessica's face flushed, but she held her ground. I may not have their titles, she said steadily, but when Ethan was drowning, it wasn't titles that mattered. It was action. That's something money can't buy. A hush fell. Even some of Richard's allies shifted uncomfortably, a dangerous revelation. Later that evening, as Jessica stepped outside for air, Ignacio Vega appeared from the shadows. His voice was low, urgent. Miss Carter, you need to know something. Richard's plan goes deeper than you think. He's not just trying to humiliate you. He's trying to bury you completely. Jessica's eyes narrowed. Why are you telling me this? Ignacio hesitated, his hardened mask cracking. Because I've done his dirty work too long. And because I saw the way you pulled that boy from the water. You don't deserve what's coming. What is coming? Ignacio's answer chilled her. He's planting evidence. Financial fraud, theft, even fabricated witness statements. He wants to ruin your name legally, not just socially. And once it's done, there will be no saving you. Jessica staggered back, heart pounding. So what do I do? Fight smart, Ignacio said. Get allies outside his reach, journalists, lawyers, people who can't be bought. But you need to move fast. He's weeks away from striking. Jessica's resolve that night. Jessica confided everything to Jonathan. He listened, jaw clenched, then said words that changed everything. Then we take him to court. We drag all of it into the light. If my father wants war, he'll get it. But in front of a judge, not in the shadows. Jessica shook her head. Jonathan, this isn't just about us. If we fight him, we risk everything. Your company, your reputation, Ethan's peace. Jonathan took her hands. Then let it burn. Because if protecting Ethan means bowing to my father's cruelty, then I'm no father at all. And if loving you means losing everything else, then so be it. The final blow, but Richard wasn't finished. The very next morning, federal agents arrived at Jessica's apartment in Queens with a warrant. They tore through drawers, dumped boxes, searched under mattresses. They left carrying evidence, falsified bank documents, photos doctored to suggest an affair with a married city official, receipts of supposed bribes. The news broke within hours, heroine or hustler. Shocking evidence ties Jessica Carter to financial scandal. Television anchors dissected it, newspapers splashed it across front pages, and the same society women who had once clapped for her whispered in triumph, "We knew it. Jonathan stormed into his father's penthouse. "You framed her?" he roared. Richard didn't flinch. "I protected this family. One day you'll thank me." Jonathan's fists shook. "The day I thank you will be the day I'm no longer your son." Ethan's breaking point. That evening, Ethan overheard the news. Tears welled in his eyes as he clung to Jonathan. "Daddy, they're lying about Jessie, right? She wouldn't do bad things." "She wouldn't." Jonathan pulled him close, voice breaking. "She wouldn't, son. She's good. She's the bravest person we've ever known. And we're going to prove it." Ethan's tiny hands gripped his father's shirt. "Then we have to fight. Because if Jessie goes away, I'll lose her like I lost Mommy, and I can't do that again." Jonathan kissed his son's head, fire blazing in his chest. In that moment he knew. The war had reached its final stage, Jessica's freedom, Ethan's healing, and the Miller legacy itself. All of it would be decided in the courtroom, under the blinding lights of truth.